Welcome everyone to our event that we are hosting as part of the G7 and G20 research groups here in London in anticipation of the UK hosting the G7 summit this year or next year. My name is Denisse Rudich. I am director of the G7 and G20 research groups here in London. I'm a strategic advisor on financial crime prevention and co-founder of Elementary B. Before we continue, I would like to say thank you very much to Madeline Koch, without whom none of this would ever be possible, and also Sonja Dobson, who has been instrumental in making this event a possibility today. So thank you very much, Madeline and Sonja, and also to our partners at the Global Governance Project, who produce some pretty phenomenal books that tend to go to the heads of state and government. So thank you very much for also your continued and ongoing support with our endeavors with the G7 and G20 research groups. A couple of housekeeping pieces before I introduce our speakers. If you can please, this event is being recorded. We considered having Chatham House, but as it is on Zoom, and it is a virtual event, that makes it a little bit difficult. So please be aware that the event is being recorded. Also, if you're not speaking, we would ask that you please go on mute just to make sure that there isn't the strange sounds that you sometimes hear in the background. And now I am delighted to introduce our stellar lineup of speakers who will be guiding us through a whirlwind tour of UK G7 summitry. And hopefully giving us some recipes for G7 summit success. We'll be looking at the history of the G7 from a UK lens, from London to Lochern and beyond. With regards to structure, we do have the first part of this event will be a speaking portion of the event, and then we will allow for Q&A towards the end. Now, if you have any questions, please do feel free to put it on chat, or if you can just let us know that you would like to ask a question. Again, if you can put that on chat, then we will do our best to get to you towards the latter portion of the event. Okay, so I am delighted in terms of kind of how this event will be going. I am delighted to let you know that we will be beginning with the wonderful, I call him one of my favorite British gentlemen, Sir Nicholas Bayne. Sir Nicholas is a former G7 Sherpa and diplomat who has actually been at the negotiating table at G7 summits. And he will be providing a brief historical overview of the UK's role at G7 summits starting in the 1970s. Sir Nicholas will be followed by Professor Hugo Dobson. Hugo Dobson, sorry Hugo, I know how to say your name, from Sheffield University. I like to think of Hugo as the world's most knowledgeable person on Japan and G7 summitry, who is full of kindness and wit, and he will be speaking on the UK at recent G7 summits. Hugo will be followed by the formidable Professor John Kirton. John is I'm telling you how I like to think of people. He is the world's foremost G7 expert, and he will be sharing insights from the US's role in the summit sphere in 2020, and that might be for the UK in 2021. We're then going to shift course a little bit and look at two policy issues that the UK has spearheaded and put on the agenda at Lochern, and I hope that it will continue, or maybe something that could be put up for consideration as a policy priority for the UK this year. And that will be first, speaking will be the brilliant Julia Kulik, who will speak on gender and gender-based violence. And I will take a few moments to say a few words on illicit finance. And just with regards to Julia's role, Julia is Director of Research for the G7 Research Group. So without further ado, introductions are over, and I'm going to hand it over to you, Sir Nicholas. Thank you.
Thank you, Denisse, and welcome everybody. I'm going to go through the UK contribution to the first 40 years of G7 summitry, one Prime Minister at a time. I'll stick to economic content, leaving out politics. Harold Wilson was only at the first summit, but he established the basic UK presence, and this regards the summit as the personal instrument of the head of government. The UK Sherpa should always be close to the Prime Minister, either the Cabinet Secretary or a senior member of the PM's personal staff. So UK Sherpas have direct access to their principal, which gives them great authority. Jim Callaghan attended 3 summits and stressed the informality of the summit. He said, "The numbers attending are small and compact. Discussions are businesslike and to the point. We do not make speeches at one another. We talk frankly, but also as briefly as we can, and a lot of ground is covered." Callaghan focused on economic policy to promote growth. The London summit he chaired didn't produce durable results. So he was the first to envisage the cross-issue deal on growth, energy and trade agreed at Bonn a year later. And this was an early example of iteration, where the G7 doesn't get things right first time. Margaret Thatcher had to bring in unpopular anti-inflation measures. And at her very first summit, she was glad to find the other leaders urging strict monetary policies to bring down prices. This G7 strategy boosted her efforts to transform the British economy and led her to value the summit so much that she twice broke off election campaigns to attend. But apart from this, she left little mark on the G7 summits, though she attended 12 and chaired one in London in 1984. John Major chaired his first summit soon after taking office, and I was there as the FCO sous chef. The G7 met as the Soviet Empire was collapsing, and it had a very heavy agenda. It made progress on the environment, helping Eastern Europe, and debt relief for poor countries. But it critically failed to conclude the GATT trade round or to give proper support to Gorbachev, who had been invited to attend. Major concluded that the summits would do better if they had simpler procedures, dropped supporting ministers, and addressed fewer topics. And he campaigned for reforms on these lines at the 5 more summits that he attended, but made little progress. Tony Blair attended 11 subjects and chaired 2 of them, which gave him scope to make his mark. For example, Major's groundwork enabled Blair to transform the summit process at Birmingham in 1998. This was the first summit where leaders met alone without other ministers. The G7 also became G8 by adding Russia. Blair chose short agendas, 3 items for Birmingham, jobs, crime and finance, and only 2 for Gleneagles in 2005, climate change and Africa. The summit documents were much more concise than before. Blair made good use of iteration. Birmingham's decisions on both financial architecture and debt relief proved inadequate, but they laid the basis for good progress of the Cologne summit a year later. Iteration at Gleneagles wound up debt relief, first addressed back in 1988, and boosted the G7's flagging Africa program. At Gleneagles, Blair brought non-G8 leaders to the summit table, not only African presidents, but also leaders from emerging powers for the climate change debate. But this innovation didn't last. And finally, Blair sought and won the backing of civil society at both his summits on debt relief and help for Africa. Gordon Brown attended just 2 G8 summits. He was a strong advocate of G70 summits and chaired its 2nd meeting. But he still thought the G8 summit should continue, though with a lower profile. David Cameron went 6 times to the summit and chaired it in 2013 at Loch Earth. By then, the G8 was focusing more on political than economic issues, but Cameron realized it had to define an economic role if it was to survive. Yet, if the G8 seemed to challenge the G20, it would meet strong resistance. Cameron decided the G8 should pledge to put their own house in order and aim to complement the work of the G20 without conflicting with it. For this purpose, he chose another short agenda: trade, tax, and transparency. The trade item focused on plurilateral agreements among G8 members, leaving multilateral issues to the G20. The tax debate was welcome to the G20 as it meshed in well with what the St. Petersburg summit would do later that year. A year later, the 40th summit became G7 again after Russia was suspended over Crimea. And by that time, I was becoming less involved in summitry. So I won't comment on the recent influence of Donald Trump. Let me instead sum up my findings on what the UK has contributed to G7 summitry. First, we regard the summit as the personal instrument of the heads and organize the preparations accordingly. Second, we strongly prefer informal debate in a compact group. Third, we favor short agendas and concise documents. Fourth, since the summit may not solve problems first time, we make constructive use of iteration. And fifth, we promote compatibility with the G20 summit on economic issues. Preserving these elements, in my view, would give the UK the best prospects for a successful summit in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Nicholas, for that great overview of the UK's role. If we can hand it over to Professor Hugo Dobson, please. Thank you, Hugo.
Thank you very much, Denise. Sir Nicholas is always a very difficult act to follow, but I'll try and do my best and try and complement what he said already by bringing the story up to date and looking at some recent summits, particularly since the resignation of David Cameron in 2016 and the Taormina, Charleroi and Bayreuth summits that followed. I think Sir Nicholas would hopefully agree with me that one of the defining qualities of these summits lies in the personal encounter between leaders and the interpersonal relationships that they can build up between each other, ultimately with the goal of providing the necessary political leadership to make a breakthrough on the issue of the day. So in the case of the UK, we obviously need to pay attention to models of prime ministerial leadership. Now, traditionally, this field as a subject of research has placed its emphasis on three mid-range factors. Firstly, executive politics, from looking at the centrality of the role of the Prime Minister through to cabinet government, and on to core executive studies as a compromise between the two that brings in other individuals and other institutions into play. Secondly, party leadership. Obviously, the Prime Minister of the day is also the leader of a party and has to manage the intra-party dynamics. And thirdly, the skills and the style of an individual Prime Minister, how those performative skills matter, how they relate to governing competence. And this gets us thinking about the personalisation of politics as well as celebrity politics. However, if we're going to get a fuller picture of prime ministerial leadership in general and in the context of these summits, I think we might be missing something both at the micro level and at the macro level. At the micro level, I wonder if there's a need to include psychological aspects of individual prime ministers. My own interest is in Japanese politics, and I don't think you could understand the success of Prime Minister Abe's second administration without understanding the failure of his first administration and how the second attempt was almost an attempt at redemption. At the macro level, we need to think about the broader context within which prime ministers are operating. Rising inequality, rising populism, Brexit, anti-politics, and obviously the pandemic, which has exacerbated all of these things. Now, of course, all of these things are interconnected. As shown in the case of Tony Blair, he was able to exert prime ministerial leadership because he had large parliamentary majorities, he managed his party relatively effectively. However, that majority was a consequence of his performance as leader of the opposition and the shift in voter perceptions as regards the Labour Party. That was in part a consequence of his personal leadership skills and how he managed to repackage the Labour Party onto the centre ground of British politics. Conversely, he also contributed negatively to his own operating environment as a result of his intervention in Iraq. But in the context of global symmetry, as Sir Nicholas has already mentioned, we can see Blair able to exercise strong prime ministerial leadership, able to innovate and reform the G8 summit process, bringing Russia into the process, separating out leaders from their finance and foreign ministers at the Birmingham summit, and ultimately being responsible for one of the most high-profile and successful summits at Gleneagles in 2005. So trying to apply this fuller picture of prime ministerial leadership to recent prime ministers and recent summits, I think we can get a richer understanding, but it is, I would argue, an understanding of weak summit performances. So as regards Theresa May, first of all, the context in which she was operating. She became Prime Minister in the aftermath of David Cameron's resignation and the Brexit referendum, an immediately challenging environment that any leader would find difficult. But this was exacerbated by continuing austerity and rising populism. Secondly, executive politics. May tried to provide strong leadership, but was never fully in charge of her cabinet. She has one of the highest rates of cabinet resignations of any Prime Minister. She tried to address this by calling an election in 2017, which she didn't need to call. She tried to adopt a presidential campaign, stressing strong and stable, but ultimately backfired and lost the majority. In terms of party dynamics, she was unable to heal a divided party, and the scale of divisions in the Conservative Party was huge. As a result of that 2017 election, she was dependent on the Democratic Unionists, and ultimately she was leader in name only. Her skills and style, clearly she was not comfortable with the public, not able to be a brand for a party, unable to operate with small talk or exhibit emotional intelligence, and was poor in dealing with the media. She could have been a good Prime Minister in calmer, more normal times, but not in these crisis situations. And psychologically, May comes across as introverted, conformist, robotic even. We know the term Maybot, you've been used to describe Theresa May. Unable to make tough decisions, kept changing her mind, and there were questions about how she dealt with the pressure. Think about her resignation speech when she returned to number 10 in tears, compared to David Cameron, who returned to number 10 whistling nonchalantly. As a result, it's no surprise to see that Theresa May struggled at the two summits she attended. Brexit deadlock was the challenging context throughout her premiership and made discussions with European partners difficult, while she had to keep an eye on rebellions and resignations at home. At the Taormina summit of 2017, she had to return home early to fight an election campaign that she didn't have to fight. And then there was the Trump factor, which John will talk about, but his role as disruptor-in-chief, whether it was discussion around US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement at Taormina, always unprecedented rejection of the final leaders' communique at Charleroi the following year. It's no surprise to hear that May described the Charleroi summit as difficult. Many would argue that she lacked the skills and style that are amplified in a format like the G7 and prioritises the personal encounter. Any other leader might have been able to rely upon these skills to mitigate against such a challenging environment. As regards Boris Johnson, well, the context was he became Prime Minister in July 2019, and the context was obviously Brexit and rising populism. In terms of executive politics, cabinet appointments were made on the basis of loyalty rather than ability, and Boris has demonstrated a rather divisive them and us rhetoric. In terms of party dynamics, Boris is more popular among party members than amongst his MPs, who regarded him as high risk at the time he was appointed. But he's proved to be brutal in terms of withdrawing the whip from leading Conservatives if necessary. His skills and style would be regarded as charismatic and unconventional, Britain's Trump, and he has been very good in dealing with the media. Psychologically, he seems to be non-conformist. He probably perceives himself as heroic, a crisis leader, Churchillian, you could say, but also the flip side is that he appears chaotic and self-interested at times. But ultimately, and arguably, the only politician able or willing to break the Brexit deadlock. So at Biarritz last year, Boris had only been Prime Minister for a month before he attended his first international summit. And I'm not sure how representative we should regard his performance, especially because so much has changed since then. But we did see his interpersonal skills on display. We did see his ability to charm on display. There were no gaffes, there was no buffoonery, there were no spats. In Emmanuel Macron's words, he was well behaved. Boris managed to align himself with European partners on major foreign policy issues like Russia, Iran, and Syria, while building a rapport with Trump. Ultimately, he seemed to be enjoying himself and the interaction with other leaders, which was a huge contrast with May. As Sir Nicholas has already pointed out, the summit is prepared as a personal instrument of the head of government, with an emphasis on informal debate and within a compact group, focusing on short agendas, using iteration and seeking compatibility with the G20 on economic issues. So looking ahead to next year's G7, some obvious liberating factors for Boris so that he enjoys a large parliamentary majority as a result of last year's election, and the deadlock on Brexit has been removed. However, this has been replaced by the context of COVID and criticism of his administration's response to the crisis, as well as criticism of the core executive itself. And this has created divisions within his own party, resulting in rebellions against lockdown restrictions. In this situation, Boris has fallen back on his skills and style, recently trying to reassert himself with the departure of Dominic Cummings as his special advisor. So in short, if Bojo can regain his mojo in terms of his personal skills, and with a vaccine on the way, that might improve the overarching context, he has the potential to provide the much needed leadership at next year's G7. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Over to you, John.
Thank you. In just 29 days, that same Boris Johnson and the United Kingdom become G7 chair for 2021. Then 20 days later, Joe Biden becomes US president and brings America back into the World Health Organization, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and much else. And then 11 months after, the UK hosts the historic United Nations Summit on Climate Change to end the UK's global governance leadership in 2021. So it's a good time to ask, what did Donald Trump's US accomplish as G7 host in 2020? And what will Boris Johnson's UK do as host in 2021? In both cases, more than one might think. Let's look at America first, to use a phrase that will slowly fade away. US priorities for its G20 were first announced on October 17th, 2019, in authentically Trumpian terms, as, I quote, rejuvenating incentives for growth and prosperity, rolling back prosperity-killing regulations, ending trade barriers, and reopening energy markets by taking a lot of what we have been doing here domestically with such success and trying to encourage the rest of the world to get on board as we sit here and our economy does so well, end quote. Then to America in January came COVID-19 and its massive economic, social, and ecological costs. Among the international summit institutions of global relevance and reach, the G7 was the first rapid responder. On March 16th, Trump hosted the G7's first ever emergency summit, doing so in virtual form. And it was a significant success. It produced 26 commitments. It called for and got a bigger, broader G20 summit just 10 days later. The G7 followed with its second emergency summit on April 16th, and many ministerial meetings and statements throughout the year. Yet the regular summit, scheduled for June 10th, was repeatedly delayed and is likely disappeared. This was partly due to Trump's idea to add Russia's Vladimir Putin to destroy the democratic purity the G7 had at the core of its membership and mission since its start in 1975. Still, by mid-October, G7 members had already complied at a strong 80% with their 21 priority commitments from their Biarritz summit in August 2019. This was a strong advance from the mere 62% they had achieved when Trump took the G7's chair at the beginning of 2020. By mid-October, compliance was led by Angela Merkel's Germany at 93%, Boris Johnson's United Kingdom at 91%, the European Union at 86%, Justin Trudeau's Canada, Emmanuel Macron's France, both at 84%, and Japan, now led by Yoshihide Suga at 76%. Then came Trump's United States at 65%, and Giuseppe Conte's Italy, which will host the G20 in 2021, at 60%. Above all, by December 2nd, yesterday, the G20 had completely kept its March 16th summit commitment to, quote, support the launch of joint research projects and the sharing of facilities towards rapid development of treatments and a vaccine. Here, the UK was first in approving a fully tested vaccine for use within a week, but backed by governments, firms, and universities, and not only Oxford, throughout the G7 and individuals from democracies beyond. So G7 governance is still alive and well during or despite disruptive Donald Trump's year-at host. Trump did leave Boris Johnson a firm foundation on which to build, but also much to do to make up for lost time when Prime Minister Johnson hosts his scheduled summit in late spring or early summer, in person perhaps, or at least in digital form. Johnson will be joined there, I think a key success factor, by all the G20 veterans but one, for Donald Trump will then be home alone. Yet G7 summiteers must still cope with the surging COVID crisis and scars, and building back better in transformative ways, including by reinforcing and reforming the major multilateral organizations struggling on their own to meet the global needs. G7 leaders will thus focus on the 5 C's of COVID, climate change, connectivity in the digital age, commerce after Brexit, and China in so many ways. On COVID, they must meet their March 16th commitment to ensure the vaccine's manufacture, distribution, and above all, accessibility. Their words, not mine. Will they do so as the Director General of the World Health Organization and the global scientific community demands by first vaccinating some people in all countries, led by frontline healthcare workers and their most vulnerable patients, rather than all people in some countries, led by the G7 ones? Again, the big question, does the G7 govern selfishly just for itself or for the world as a whole? On climate change, the world's only existential threat, in 2021, G7 action must go beyond what had been completely crowded out by COVID last year, even as global greenhouse gas concentrations and temperatures reach new highs in the air, land, and C. In 2021, the G7 must immediately kill killer coal, end fossil fuel subsidies, and start growing 1 trillion more trees, and commit to effectively achieve decarbonized electricity, energy, and buildings by 2025, and net zero emissions by 2023. Boris Johnson's got off to a good start on many of these things at home, but can he get the full G7 to go along next year? Finally, to do this and the other things, G7 leaders need to hold another emergency summit soon after Joe Biden becomes US president and brings America back to the G7 fully, and to back Boris Johnson's leadership there in 2021. So they should start their scheduling of this and other ones right now. Now, for more insights and information, please read the forthcoming background book entitled G7 USA, The Virtual Summits from GT Media, available on December 17th. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Wonderful, John. That was very insightful. And again, I think many people maybe did not realize that the US actually hosted some G7 summits, if only in a virtual fashion and with less fanfare than we saw with previous summits. Over to you, Julia. Looking forward to hearing about gender. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. And thank you to everyone out there who's joining us. When I was asked to offer reflections on the 2013 summit in Lough Erne, I knew immediately that my remarks would center around that year's initiative to prevent sexual violence and conflict. As part of its distinctive foundational mission, the G7 has been promoting human rights since its first summit in 1975, and promoting social advancement, specifically gender equality, since the late 90s. Following its introduction on the G7 agenda and communique, attention to gender equality and related issues remained relatively siloed and outward-looking, focusing on increasing political participation and education for women and girls in Africa, which aligns with the G7's overall outreach strategy, which included the participation of African leaders and heads of state at summits throughout the 2000s. The G7's increasing attention to gender equality in its communique was sporadically accompanied by a financial commitment from member governments. Here, the standout success came in 2010 at the Canadian-hosted summit in Muskoka, which raised $40 billion for maternal, newborn, and child health, a UN Millennium Development Goal which at that time was lagging far behind. And this success was due in large part to the leadership of Canadian-based children's-focused NGOs, who lobbied extensively for the issue to be made priority at that year's summit. This brings us to May 2012, when British Foreign Secretary William Hague announced that the UK, as part of its G8 presidency, would launch an initiative to prevent sexual violence and conflict. The UK's initiative contained 3 components. The first was a British commitment to assemble a team of experts, including criminal lawyers, gender-based violence experts, investigators, and social workers that could be easily deployed to gather evidence and testimonies to support the prosecution process. The second was a push from the British government to have G8 members come to a consensus on an international protocol for gathering such evidence. And third was recognition by members that rape and sexual violence be considered grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. No doubt top of mind were the disturbing reports out of Syria at that time about the increased prevalence of rape and sexual violence, which the International Rescue Committee identified as among the primary reasons that people have fled the country since the outbreak of civil war in 2011. The initiative was funded with an initial $36 million from G8 foreign ministers, which many felt was not enough. And while financial commitments are essential, the power of an international statement and public acknowledgement by some of the most powerful democratic nations on an issue that is often overlooked or avoided should not be understated. One must also remember that the Lough Erne Summit took place before the Me Too movement, which to its credit broke the silence on sexual assault and the degree to which it permeates our society. To date, the initiative is credited with having reduced the stigma associated with sexual violence and the risk of ostracization from victims' families and communities, supporting survivors with medical and mental health care, and supporting legal reform in countries that have recognized and prosecuted these crimes for the first time. Unfortunately, since 2014, both the visibility of the initiative and the initiative's budget have been in deep decline, due in part to the departure of its champion, William Hague, from government, and the postponement of a second summit on the issue that was set for November of last year due to the election. One might ask whether momentum would have been sustained if it was taken up at the leaders' level from the start, especially with the presence of gender equality advocates Angela Merkel and Justin Trudeau, who at his summit in 2018 raised $3.8 billion to educate girls in conflict zones. Again, thanks to the activism and push from Canadian civil society. Gender equality is likely to now have a permanent place on the G7 agenda and in the communique. Attention has expanded in scope to include, importantly, acknowledge that work is needed to achieve it in their own countries. Action is needed to increase female labor force participation, and specifically in certain sectors, to expand parental leave, and to reduce the burden of unpaid care work. It is important that the G7 not retreat on commitments to promoting and ensuring sexual and reproductive health and rights, which have been noticeably absent since 2017 and the arrival of Donald Trump. Gender equality cannot be achieved without the protection of these rights. Now looking to next year's summit, whether virtual or in person and with vaccines in hand is irrelevant, because we know that COVID-19 has already had a disproportionate effect on women, one that will require the attention of leaders when they meet for the next several years. This includes measures to increase female labor force participation, which in some countries and members has reached its lowest level in 3 decades. But it is the alarming occurrence of what the UN is now calling a shadow pandemic that requires immediate action, as several countries are registering a 25 to 40% increase in sexual and domestic violence. Given the UK's built-in legacy of addressing the issue, 2021 presents an opportunity for the G7 to take up the issue again, this time at the leaders' level, and broadening in scope to address the issue at home as well, committing new money and engaging with civil society in a meaningful way, which the UK G7 presidency has a long, successful history of doing. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. I don't know if I want to say great overview, but overview of a very, very important topic that I too hope also makes it onto the agenda at the G7 this coming year. So now I'm going to take the opportunity to speak about illicit finance and you know, how the UK has played what I believe to be a pivotal role in putting illicit finance and leading in this space on a global basis. Whenever we think about illicit finance flows, it's very easy to kind of take away the links between financial flows and transactions to things such as child soldiers, trafficking in humans, drugs being sold to youth, the trafficking in parts of endangered wildlife, the sale of counterfeit medicines and vaccines, which is really relevant in today's world, captured states, and acts of terror. So money laundering acts as the lifeline of criminals who perpetrate and commit all of these, what I like to think of as heinous acts. And the UK has long played an agenda-setting role in the field of illicit finance at G7 summits. Excuse me. At the 1989 Paris summit, the UK and the US spearheaded the development of the Global Anti-Money Laundering Standard Setter, the Financial Action Task Force. And at subsequent G7 summits hosted by the UK, there have been an element of financial crime prevention that has been weaved into the agenda in one form or another. In London in 1991, G7 leaders committed to stepping up the fight against money laundering and drugs. In 1998 at the Birmingham summit, again, drugs were on the agenda, but the net was widened to cast to cover international crime, non-proliferation, and the introduction of export controls. So again, sanctions. The G7 also called on the creation of what has become the global FATF style regional bodies network to support the efforts of less developed countries, and tax also made an appearance. The 2005 Gleneagles Summit was held immediately after the London 7/7 terrorist attacks, and that essentially kind of made countries take a renewed stand against terrorism. On the agenda, there were the issue of piracy, and was elevated. Again, piracy is seen as a driver of or as a source of terrorist financing, as well as non-proliferation. And countries committed to building international cooperation to combat terrorist financing. But really, it was at the 2013 Lochern Summit that the UK placed financial crime, the financial crime prevention, front and center on the world stage as part of its 3 T's agenda, which was trade, tax, and transparency. So what did the UK deliver at Lochern in this space? And for those of you working in this field, and I see that there are actually many colleagues and of mine that are on the call or on the call or on the Zoom line, not the call, the virtual event. These are topics that we have all been working on for the past 7 years. In the area of tax, there was agreement with the Crown dependencies and overseas territories on automatic exchange of information. In the area of anti-money laundering, they talked about ensuring that anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regimes are effective in G8 countries and high-growth countries. They also published the action plan to prevent the misuse of companies and legal arrangements, again, areas that we continue to work on in this day, and that were, again, elevated by the release of the FinCEN files earlier this year. And G8 countries committed to publishing national action plans to tackle money laundering, tax evasion, and also to self-report to FATF. Most of those national action plans, again, today, they cover national risk assessments. They cover the preventing the misuse of bearer shares and nominee shareholdings, effective supervision, which again continues to be something that's spotlighted in this field at the moment. Dissuasive sanctions for corporate wrongdoers. So we have seen an incremental, I would say exponential increase in the amount of fines, and currently escapes me, but we're looking at billions of dollars in fines from regulators, as well as promoting cross-border cooperation to fight the abuse of corporate structures, and returning stolen assets to countries in transitions, which is actually a lot more difficult than it sounds. In the area of terrorist financing, again, reducing terrorist groups' access to funding, highlighting the threat to piracy, or the threat of piracy and it acting as a source of terrorist funding. And they also called for countries to expel non-state actors linked to terrorism. But where it really, Lochern made quite the splash on the world stage, particularly in this field, was in the area of anti-bribery and corruption. So they raised the global standards of extractive transparency, and basically they launched the Extractives Industry Transparency Initiative, or set the groundwork for that to be launched. And they developed global reporting standards for multinational corporations and countries with large extractive industries. However, I know that there were many who worked on this for what seems like it was over a decade. They also issued commitments to develop beneficial ownership registries in trusted companies and also improve access to information. And not only did they commit to that within the G8 structure at that time, but they also pulled in and got agreement from the Crown, the overseas territory, Crown dependencies and overseas territories in this space, which again was something that for years, different countries have been trying to move forward with this. So together, these commitments not only allow the UK government to drive forward the domestic reforms in this space, but also to lead on global initiatives in financial crime prevention. Now, following Lochern, the UK and the US launched the inaugural G8 Sub-Saharan Africa Public-Private Sector Dialogue, which is a name that just rolls off the tongue, on anti-money laundering, and it was hailed as an excellent event. And sadly, there hasn't been another one since that time. In 2016, the UK also hosted a global summit on anti-corruption with leaders calling from an unprecedented global coalition to tackle the cancer of corruption. Now I'm going to give Nick Maxwell, who I know is on here, a bit of a shout out because he was, I think he was instrumental as well in organizing the summit and did a fantastic job. Now, this was the first summit of its kind with representatives from over 40 countries meeting with business, civil society, and members of the sports community, because there is a lot of corruption in sports. And it was hailed generally as a success. Which leads me to what could be a recipe for success for the next British presidency at the G7, well, of the G7 summit. I will, I think, reiterate the G7 is a recognized global leader in the field of financial crime prevention, not without its flaws, but still a leader in this space. And as the UK finds its feet and moves forward to global Britain, it should place illicit financial flows and corruption front and center at the G7 agenda, and maybe weave it through something like the 5 Cs that were mentioned by John earlier of COVID, climate change, connectivity, commerce, and I would add, instead of China, corruption. By linking tackling illicit finance flows to global economy and sustainable development, trade promotion, good governance, pandemic response, it has 2 opportunities. First, it will allow it to safeguard the security and prosperity of the UK at home. And second, it will prevent the exploitation by criminals and corrupt elites of the trillions of pounds that continue to be injected and flow through the global economy to support the world's most vulnerable and ensure the equitable access to medical supplies and vaccines. So in terms of what are some specific topics that could be added onto the G7 summit agenda, I would love the idea of the creation of common data standards and responsible adoption of technology to support global data sharing. Explore the convergence between money laundering, fraud, and cyber. And we have seen computer and mobile enables fraud skyrocket this past year because of COVID and ways of working. Again, corruption, there's so much to say about corruption, but I think I loathe to think that the new form of corruption and criminality would look like elites, not just in emerging countries and states that have been captured states, but elites stockpiling vaccines, and also for the sale of counterfeit vaccines and treatments that actually could result in further death. And unfortunately, that is the reality. And Africa, I think the UK should definitely pull its focus back to Africa and other emerging economies. The UN highlighted earlier this year that Africa loses 89 billion each year due to illicit capital flight, which are just astronomical amounts. And I would love to see linking financial crime to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and inequality, which again, happy to talk about that a little bit more if we have time in the Q&A. So the last thing I would say is that the COVID pandemic has propelled us further into a world without borders. We have data without borders, we have service provision without borders, and we have crime without borders. And I think that the UK can use the G7 to develop an updated approach to tackle illicit financial flows in what is effectively a changed world. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over to Sonja, who's going to be taking Q&A, and I see that some comments have also popped up in chat. So really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Okay, so as Denise mentioned earlier, if you do have a question or if you would like to ask a question, just make a note in the chat box. We do have one question to start with already from Brittany. It's for anyone, but potentially more directed towards John. How successful do you think the UK will be in getting the G7 members to increase their climate ambition at the summit? Or will Johnson pass the buck to the UN as he is hosting the UN Climate Summit in 2021 as well?
A great question. And we have seen during the long durée both sides, the best of worlds, the worst of the worlds. One is G7 and G20 summits saying, oh, there's going to be a big UN one pretty soon. So let's spend our scarce time on doing other stuff that we have a better chance of succeeding at. and one of the reasons why the UN summit Copenhagen 2009 so spectacularly failed. But we've also seen the other side. And here I go back to 1979, when it was the G7 summit that invented the global governance of climate change, putting in place the most ambitious and effective control regime the world has ever seen. So not only another world is possible, but it's been done a long time ago. And here I do think that particularly with climate change basically missing last year, with Joe Biden coming in, and for him, it really is priority number one, maybe tied with a few others in top place. So that will mean a very strong start in the first half of 2021. And Boris is fully on board. He was the first or second G7 member to actually kill killer coal at home, where my list start. So he's got every reason to bond with Biden, maybe with a new bilateral trade deal in the back of his mind. And I recall, I did mention continuity in my remarks, but I do remember Sir Nicholas Bayne saying wisely that some of the best summits are where you do have brand new leaders, right, who want to really make a mark, a new burst of energy. So that's why we've got Biden, and I'm sure Boris Johnson can invent himself as being relatively brand new, the post-Brexit Biden, if you will. So that's why I'm optimistic. But of course, there's no time to lose.
Well, that was a very substantial answer. Thanks, John. John, you also had a question for Hugo. Would you like to ask him directly, or like me to read it out?
Sure. Hugo, the question is, you spoke very insightfully of Boris Johnson. I think you called him Bojo's personal style and what lay in his mind behind. So my question is, will Bojo's style well match that of Joe Biden, who I'm now starting to think of as Joe Bi or Bi Joe, as much as Boris Johnson's style would have matched that of Donald Trump, which you suggested it would in your remarks? And will we see the best of that when the two come together at Boris Johnson's summit or summits in 2021?
Thanks for that, John. Just to piggyback on the previous question and your answer, I don't think it's a zero-sum game between the two big global governance events in the UK next year. I think the two will be mutually reinforcing. Again, my interest is predominantly in Japanese politics, but if you go back to 2008, the year that Japan hosted the G8 summit, as well as the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, the Japanese government was deliberately trying to create a synergy between the two events to ensure the success of both. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think both of them are mutually reinforcing. As regards Bojo and Joe Bi, I'm not sure Joe Bi is going to catch on in the same way that Bojo catches on, but I think the thing about Boris is, insofar as any of us actually know who he is, I think he can be anything to anybody. And, at Biarritz, he managed to be charming to Macron at the same time as cozying up to Trump. So, I think he's self-interested, he's a chameleon-like character. I think he'll adapt to the leaders that he's surrounded by. I don't think Joe Biden and Boris Johnson will be natural bedfellows. I think they come, from totally different backgrounds. And there have been a few media reports after Biden's election suggesting that Boris is not quite flavour of the month in the Oval Office. But I think Boris will be in full charm offensive next year.
Thank you for that, Hugo. So Nicholas Maxwell has a question. This seems to be a question for the whole panel. Where does the panel really feel that the G7 adds value compared to the G20? Is there a challenge of relevance or legitimacy, given changing economic fundamentals to the sustainability of the grouping?
Julia, do you want to have a go?
Sure. I think that is a good question. I'll maybe just go back to the start of my remarks, which noted the foundational mission of the G7 is part of it is to promote human rights and individual liberty. That is not something that the G20 was or has committed to. Started largely as an economic forum. And then I think just in terms of relevance, I personally don't see relevance as an issue. The G7 has shown consistently that it's been able to respond to challenges as they arise. And I think that is due in part to some degree to its small size, because it can move faster. It's not constrained by a bureaucracy in ways that some other institutions are. I think legitimacy is a fair point, but would just add that the G7 is never just a meeting of its members. It has the engagement of outreach, civil society outreach, as well as invited country guests. Granted, they are not permanent members, but they're invited based on their strategic capabilities and interest on issues that the summit is addressing during that year.
Wonderful. So we'll go with one last question quickly because we are about at the end of the time. And this is for Sir Nicholas. First part of this question is, it was interesting to hear from you that Lady Thatcher did not leave much mark at the G7 with all her presence and character. Could you elaborate about this? And then second, I apologize if I do not pronounce this correctly, Mr. Giscard d'Estaing passed away today. May we have your comment on him, one of the founding fathers of the G7? Just to remind you, we are a little bit over our time, so if you want to answer quickly, unfortunately, that will bring us to the end of our event today.
Let me respond quickly, though I shall shock people, I feel sure, by saying that Margaret Thatcher resembled Donald Trump in some respects, in that she really wasn't interested in meeting of minds. She was interested in getting her way. And really the G7 summit is not a good vehicle for people who want to get their way at the expense of others. As for President Giscard d'Estaing, who was the joint parent, I would say, of the G7 summit, it was him and Chancellor Helmut Schmidt of Germany. His great insight was to see that at that moment in the 1970s, there was an opportunity for the Europeans and Japan to dilute the sole hegemony of the United States, because the United States was in a state of mind, the president, with an insecure president, Gerald Ford, and with Kissinger looking for new opportunities. So that was the time when the idea of collective management of the world economy, rather than US hegemony, could take root, and it's been going strong ever since. Thank you.
All right, so that brings us to the end. Unfortunately, Maria, we didn't have a chance to get to your question, but if you would like to potentially email one of our panel members, I'm sure they'd be more than happy to respond. I just want to say thank you to all of the speakers today. I think I can speak for everyone, saying that we've had quite a much deeper insight on the G7 and the UK's leadership. So hopefully we can see better things next year coming from the UK. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. And of course, for all the questions.